What you're about to hear has been buried for centuries. Subscribe now, because we're just getting started. A New York nephrologist named Karl Skorecki once said, "The moment that started all of this wasn't in a lab. It was in synagogue watching an unrelated man called up for the same ceremonial honor he was. A role passed only from father to son, for as long as anyone could remember. Curiosity is a strange thing in a scientist. It doesn't stay quiet. So years later, a different but related test began. This one thousands of miles away and stripped of ritual entirely. Cold, clinical, blood samples logged and sequenced. The men supplying them had never met. They didn't share a language. Their families hadn't lived on the same continent in over 1,000 years. One traced his line to Yemen, one to Ukraine, one to Ethiopia, one to Iraq. 4 corners of the map, 4 unconnected histories, brought together only by blood draws and a research protocol. The Y chromosome, the genetic thread passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, like a name that never gets misspelled, should have told 4 different stories. 2,000 years of exile, war, conversion, and intermarriage should have scrambled any shared signal into statistical noise. That's what population genetics predicts. That's what happens to every other scattered group in the historical record. It didn't happen here. The markers matched. Not loosely, not similar enough to guess at, matched, at a rate that made the researchers run the numbers twice, because a result like that isn't supposed to survive 2,000 years of dispersal intact. If exile is supposed to erase a signature, why didn't it erase this one? What did these scientists find in the blood of Jewish men from 4 different continents that made them question everything they thought they knew about how ancestry survives? For most of the 20th century, the working assumption in mainstream anthropology was straightforward. Jewish identity was a matter of religion and culture, not shared descent. After the Roman expulsion from Judea in 70 CE, communities scattered across the Mediterranean, into Mesopotamia, and eventually across Europe, absorbing local languages, local food, and, many assumed, local ancestry through centuries of intermarriage and conversion. It was a clean, humane story. It fit the historical record of displacement. Most researchers had no reason to question it, except for one detail demographers kept running into, quietly, for decades. The number of converts required to explain later population growth never actually added up. By the Middle Ages, the cultural picture seemed to confirm the theory anyway. Ashkenazi Jews in Central and Eastern Europe looked, on the surface, almost entirely European. The clothing, the vernacular, the folk customs. Sephardi Jews across Iberia and North Africa were culturally Mediterranean down to the cuisine. Mizrahi Jews across the Middle East were, to an outside observer, nearly indistinguishable from their Muslim and Christian neighbors. Same dress, same food, often the same spoken language. Culture said, assimilation. Culture said, no unifying thread left to find. And yet, in the 1970s, a small number of physicians started noticing something that culture couldn't explain. The same rare genetic diseases, Tay-Sachs among them, kept surfacing in Jewish patients on opposite sides of an ocean. Patients with no known family connection, no shared geography, no shared language. By every standing rule of population genetics, disease markers that specific shouldn't cluster in a population this spread out. Geneticists filed it away as an anomaly. Nobody had the tools yet to explain it. The dominant academic theory held anyway, for another 2 decades. Religion, not descent, was the through line. Historians pointed to groups like the Khazars, a Turkic empire whose ruling elite reportedly converted to Judaism around the 8th century, as proof that Jewish ancestry was less a bloodline and more a patchwork stitched together by conversion, generation after generation, community after community. But when geneticists finally had tools sensitive enough to actually test that claim, instead of just theorize about it, the patchwork story ran straight into a number nobody could explain away. Here is where it gets complicated. In 1997, a research team publishing in the journal Nature reported something in the Y chromosomes of Jewish priestly families that geneticists still cite today as one of the strangest confirmations of oral tradition on record. It started with Karl Skorecki, a nephrologist at the Technion in Haifa. Skorecki was a Kohen, a member of the Jewish priestly line, a status passed strictly from father to son, unbroken for as long as the tradition had been kept. He wanted to know something simple. Did other Kohanim, men he'd never met, with no traceable family connection to him at all, share identifiable genetic markers on the Y chromosome, that same paternal thread, passed down like an unbroken chain of custody? Working with Michael Hammer at the University of Arizona, the team pulled Y chromosome samples from Kohanim in two communities that had been separated for over 500 years with almost no contact. Ashkenazi Kohanim in Europe, Sephardi Kohanim across the Mediterranean and Middle East. You'd expect 5 centuries of separation to blur any shared signal past recognition. You'd be wrong. The result, published that year, a specific cluster of Y chromosome markers, later named the Cohen modal haplotype, turned up in Kohanim at a rate far exceeding chance, and far higher than in the general Jewish population surveyed alongside them. It didn't just confirm a family resemblance. It directly undercut the patchwork of conversions theory laid out a moment ago, because a culturally inherited title, a role assigned at birth and never proven by paperwork, was tracking something real underneath it, an actual, unbroken paternal bloodline, matching what the Torah's own genealogies had claimed all along, and one that had survived 2,000 years and 2 separate diasporas without dissolving into noise. Clean, unexpected, not supposed to still be there. Hammer's team went further, calculating a most recent common ancestor date for the Cohen modal haplotype at roughly 106 generations back, an estimate landing startlingly close to the traditional dating of the priestly line to the era of the First Temple, nearly 3,000 years ago. Researchers are careful to frame a figure like that as a probability estimate, not a certainty. Generation length assumptions shift the math. But the order of magnitude alone stopped people in the field. This wasn't even the anomaly anyone had gone looking for. It fell out of a side question about priesthood, almost by accident, and it forced a far larger re-examination of Jewish population genetics as a whole. Not by years, by centuries. That's the distance this signal had to cross to still be sitting there, intact, waiting to be found. If a single paternal lineage could survive 2 exiles and 1,000 years of separation without fragmenting, what would happen if researchers stopped looking at one priestly family line and started testing entire communities against each other? That question sent a much larger international team back into the data, and what they found didn't just confirm the priestly result. It suggested nearly every Jewish community on Earth was carrying a shared signature that, by the standing rules of the field, shouldn't have survived at all. Doron Behar, leading a large international consortium, published the genome-wide answer to that question in Nature in 2010, moving past a single lineage to test whole populations against each other directly. His team analyzed genome-wide data from Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi Jewish populations, set against non-Jewish comparison groups drawn from the same regions. The finding, despite being scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for well over 1,000 years, most Jewish populations clustered together genetically far more tightly with each other than with their immediate non-Jewish geographic neighbors. A pattern Behar's team described as consistent with a shared Middle Eastern origin dating back roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years, followed by long periods of relative genetic isolation. The theory had real explanatory power. It accounted for the Cohen modal haplotype. It accounted for the disease clusters physicians had puzzled over back in the 1970s. It lined up with historical accounts of diaspora communities maintaining religious endogamy, marrying within the community, generation after generation, for most of their recorded history. Isolation, endogamy, continuity. Isolation, endogamy, continuity. The same 3 words kept surfacing, no matter which population the team tested. But the model had a limit, and it showed up in exactly one place. Ashkenazi Jews carried a measurable share of ancestry that didn't trace neatly back to the Levant at all. Behar's own data hinted at a European maternal line contribution the shared origin model, on its own, couldn't fully account for. The shared ancestry model explained more than almost anyone in the field expected going in, but it left one piece of the Ashkenazi genome sitting there, unresolved. And a second, far more complicated explanation was about to become the most contested paper the field had seen in years. That unresolved piece had a name, and by 2013, Doron Behar was ready to put a number on it. Working again with a major consortium, Behar turned this time to mitochondrial DNA. The genetic line passed only from mother to child, generation after generation, like a signature that only one parent gets to sign. What he found didn't just complicate the picture, it nearly inverted it. Over 80% of Ashkenazi maternal lines, by Behar's estimate, traced back to just 4 founding women, and their mitochondrial signatures looked European, not Middle Eastern. Sit with that for a second. The paternal line, the Cohen modal haplotype, the Levantine clustering, all of it, pointed east, toward Judea, toward a point of origin nearly 3,000 years old. And now the maternal line, in the very same population, was pointing somewhere else entirely. It suggested something specific. that while Ashkenazi men carried ancestry tracing strongly back to the Middle East, a large share of Ashkenazi women may have descended from local European women who joined Jewish communities, likely through conversion, in the first centuries of the diaspora's life in Italy and the Rhineland. 2 parents, 2 continents, 1 population. The clean, shared Levantine ancestry story from a moment ago wasn't clean anymore. Karl Skorecki, the same researcher whose personal curiosity had started the Priestley line study years earlier, pushed back hard. He and others argued Behar's sample sizes and reference populations were too narrow to support a claim that's sweeping, and that the 4-founder maternal signal could still be compatible with a Near Eastern origin, depending entirely on which ancient reference populations you chose to compare it against. Same data, same category of evidence, opposite conclusions, from 2 credentialed teams who'd been right about other things before. Researchers are careful, here, to frame the maternal question as a matter of probability and reference population choice, rather than settled fact. The disagreement hasn't fully closed, even now. 2 well-credentialed teams looking at the same category of data reached opposite conclusions about where Ashkenazi mothers actually came from. And that unresolved argument is exactly what opened the door to a theory almost no mainstream geneticist wanted to go near. There's a reason most researchers avoid saying this one out loud. Aaron Elhike didn't avoid it. In 2013, while at the University of Sheffield, Elhike published a paper reviving a much older and more radical idea, the Khazar hypothesis. His argument, Ashkenazi genetic origins trace substantially to the Caucasus region, tied to the historical Khazar Khaganate, a Turkic empire whose ruling elite reportedly converted to Judaism sometime around the 8th century CE. Not 4 European founding mothers grafted onto a Levantine trunk, an entirely different root system. The backlash arrived fast, and it arrived from familiar names. Behar, Skorecki, and others published a direct rebuttal, arguing Elhake's reference populations and statistical methods didn't hold up, and that the accumulated weight of the Y chromosome evidence, the autosomal clustering, and the Cohen lineage data still pointed toward a Middle Eastern origin. Here is where it gets complicated in a different way than before. Because Elhake didn't fully retreat, his later work has continued to place the Caucasus contribution at a meaningfully smaller minority share, not a wholesale replacement of Ashkenazi ancestry. Not rejected, not proven, reluctant. That's the honest status of the Khazar theory more than a decade later. The one interpretation most of the field would rather not spend airtime on, and the one that refuses to fully disappear. No side has fully closed the case. Which is exactly why, when researchers finally tried to picture what these disputed ancestors actually looked like on the ground, they had to build the scene without knowing which version of the story was true. Picture a market stall in Mainz, in the Rhineland, sometime in the 10th century. A small Jewish trading community is doing business in 3 languages at once: Hebrew reserved for prayer, a Latin-derived vernacular for the actual haggling, and Aramaic-inflected Hebrew held for scholarship and letters. These are the Radhanites' cousins, or something like them, merchants plugged into trade networks that stretch from Western Europe to the Abbasid Caliphate, moving goods and, occasionally, people, across a map most of their neighbors would never see beyond the next town. Now picture the same hour, the same century, a few thousand miles east. In Baghdad, under Abbasid rule, a different Jewish community is transacting in a language this Mainz market will never hear spoken: Judeo-Arabic, layered with its own scholarly Hebrew, its own local customs, its own version of what Jewish life looks like day to day. Neither community will ever meet. Neither knows, in any way that matters to them, that the other exists in quite this form. They are separated by geography, language, climate, ruling empire, separated by everything except one thing neither of them can see, whatever thread the geneticists, 1,000 years later, would find still running underneath. The biggest reframe in this story isn't which theory wins, it's what the disagreement itself reveals. Harry Oster, at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, synthesized much of this research in his 2012 book, and landed on the point that cuts through most of the argument. The genetic data was never going to show one clean bloodline, or one clean pattern of assimilation. It shows both, layered, unevenly, at different points on the paternal and maternal lines, in different communities, across different centuries. You'd expect 2,000 years of exile to produce either total dissolution or a perfectly preserved bloodline. It produced neither. The real anomaly, in other words, was never the fact of mixture. Mixture is the default outcome for any population spread across a continent for 2 millennia. Every historical group absorbs outsiders, loses members, blends at the edges. The anomaly was that a detectable Middle Eastern signature persisted at all. In paternal lines, in disease markers passed down through families who never met, in a priestly haplotype dated to roughly the era of the First Temple. Most dispersed populations lose a signal like that within a handful of centuries. This one didn't. Modern autosomal studies, Behar's 2010 work and the replications that followed it, now place the shared Middle Eastern component across most Jewish diaspora populations at a level consistent with surviving roughly 100 generations of geographic separation. Population geneticists studying other scattered diasporas rarely see a retention rate like that hold up at all. It wasn't a single unbroken bloodline, untouched by 2,000 years of history. And it wasn't a religious patchwork with no ancestry behind it either. It was something in between. And something in between wasn't supposed to hold together this long. There's a researcher who's spoken in interviews around this body of work about tracing his own family's Cohen status back through the data and finding the marker sitting there, waiting, exactly where the tradition said it would be, a quiet confirmation of something he'd been told as a child, long before he understood what a haplotype even was. Every population on Earth carries some version of this same tension, the story a people tells about where they came from, and the story their DNA tells. And the two don't always match. When they don't, it's rarely a clean win for either side. Most groups never get the chance to run the test at this resolution. This one did, mostly by circumstance, good record keeping, strong communal identity, and, eventually, geneticists curious enough to ask the same question Karl Skorecki once asked in a synagogue, watching a stranger called up for the same ceremonial role. The Jewish case is unusual only in how well documented and how contested it became. Decades of dueling papers in Nature and other major journals. Competing labs in Haifa, Tucson, New York, Sheffield, each holding one piece of a picture none of them could complete alone, each convinced their piece mattered most. Think of it less like a single river running in one unbroken line from source to sea, and more like an old, much-copied manuscript, written over, partially erased, written over again, so that beneath the newest layer of ink you can still, if the light is right, make out traces of what was written first. Jewish DNA didn't just shock the scientists who studied it. It's still shocking them, one contested paper at a time. And nobody currently working in this field believes the last word has been written.